there. Let me welcome you to the League of Women Voters. I have to say that we are a nonpartisan group. We do not endorse parties or candidates. What we do is try to build an informed electorate. We do that in several ways. And I'll talk more about some of our more direct ways after the end of this session. But one of the ways is that we hold these educational forums where we bring subjects of popular interest that have important policy implications to the public and try to keep good quality discussion going. So at this point, I'm going to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves. And there's Tess McFarland Porter. She's one of our board members. She's the one who brought us the idea for this webinar because she got to see the exhibit that they'll be talking about, which I missed. So I'm going to go off camera shortly. Let me say that so our speakers are going to have a 30 or 45 minutes or however long they want to talk to us. And during that time, if you think of questions you'd like to ask, you can put them in the Q&A and then we will get to them later. The chat is also open and I think they might use it to communicate with people a little bit. So try to remember to put your questions in Q&A. It's easier for me to keep track and make sure that they get asked later. All right, so I'm going off screen now and Tess, take it away.
Thanks, Barbara. Last spring, we at the Rochester League of Women Voters held a membership recruitment event where folks in the league who had been working and are continuing to work long, hard, and smart, because that's the way we do it in the league, uplifted our criminal justice position statement. And the folks working with that document waved it like a flag going into battle. This is what we're fighting for, to defend democracy and empower voters. And shortly after that membership recruitment event, I met our speakers tonight at an art gallery space on the University of Rochester campus. It was opening night of their exhibit, Going Upstate, an outgrowth of an undergraduate class they had been teaching called The Cultural Politics of Prison Towns. As I moved through the art gallery and got challenged to think about ordinary aspects of my life in different ways, like, for example, this prison-made bottle of hand sanitizer, I could feel an undergirding of the criminal justice work we had been doing in the league, and maybe even the construction of a metaphorical flagpole to attach our criminal justice position statement or our brochure, Your Right to Vote After a Felony. Something else I saw in the exhibit was that I personally knew one of the University of Rochester student researchers from several years ago. And when I reached out to tell him that I saw his work, he responded, "So amazing to see that Professors Dubler and Doughty are still doing this important work. I had such a transformational experience in their class and didn't know a snippet of our project would make it into an exhibit several years later. But that's so cool." It's also so cool that I have the privilege this evening of introducing our speakers, Kristin Doughty, Professor of Anthropology, and Joshua Dubler, Professor of Religion, both from the University of Rochester. They are collaborative ethnographers working in the field of carceral geography. Their exhibit, Going Upstate, concentrates on the prison towns of the upstate New York region and endeavors to build relationships capable of moving us beyond prisons into what follows after. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let Josh take the floor first, but just thank you. Thank you. That was such a lovely introduction. I really feel very warm. Go ahead, Josh. I'll let you start us off.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you, Tess, for the introduction. Thank you, Barbara, for organizing this. And thanks to all of you who are on the webinar. So as Tess said, Kristin and I teach at the University of Rochester, and we collaborate along with other faculty, staff, and students and community partners on a variety of projects, which take place in the classroom and out, on campus and off. A central front of our collaboration is a project called the Rochester Education Justice Initiative, which fosters higher educational opportunities for people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated in the Rochester area. And later I'll make sure to drop Reggie's URL in the chat. But we're here to talk tonight about this project that intersects with our teaching and our research. It is the project that resulted in that is this exhibit that Tess visited last spring, and which we hope to continue to display in towns around the state. So as an introductory question, because it was suggested that maybe an introductory question would be like a good way to start. And I think Tess alluded to this in the hand sanitizer, but something we ask our students on the first day of class is, where can we observe the trace of the prison in our own community, right? So you might take a moment to consider this yourselves. Where can we observe the trace of the prison in our own community? Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's obscure. This project, and Kristin will kind of give a sense of the parameters of the project and of the exhibit, belongs to an emergent, a subfield called carceral geographies. And the text that establishes carceral geographies as a subfield essentially is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California, which came out 16 years ago. So here's a passage from Golden Gulag. Prisons sit on the edge, at the margins of social spaces, economic regions, political territories, and fights for rights. This apparent marginality is a trick of perspective, because edges are also interfaces. Even while borders highlight the distinction between places, they also connect places into relationship with each other and with non-contiguous places. So too with prisons. The government organized and funded dispersal of marginalized people from urban to rural locations. I'll repeat that. The government organized and funded dispersal of marginalized people from urban to rural locations suggests both that problems stretch across space in a connected way, that arenas for activism are less segregated than they seem. Viewed in this way, we see how prison is actually in the middle of the muddle that confronts all modestly educated working people and their extended communities at the dawn of the 21st century. So prisons are placed at the periphery, but that isn't also a trick of perspective. And what carceral geographies invites us to do is that rather than thinking of prisons on the periphery, what happens if we center prisons in our analyses of American politics, of American culture, of American economics? What do we see when we center the prison in that way? So hopefully you can see my screen now. Both Kristin and I are ethnographers, and as being ethnographers, we believe that particularities matter, right? Specific places might evince general rules, but the specifics matter. So here we are. This is the New York Department of Corrections and Community Supervision Facilities map, and I'm going to zoom in this part of the state where we live and where I believe most of the people on this call live. So you can see the different facilities, 5 Points, Cayuga, Elmira, Groveland, etc. I like to say that in Western New York, the local history of incarceration is world history, right? So it's not hyperbole at all to say that Auburn Prison is the prototype for the modern prison. It's at 1822, the Auburn Prison comes online, and it proves to be a kind of prison where people live in cells individually but work in silence on shop floors. It proves to be a prison that can be scalable and reproduced, and it is reproduced around the country. Elmira Prison is the first reformatory. So this is in the 1870s, in a kind of progressive era where prisons were reimagined, as prisons are frequently reimagined as places where people who have been debauched can receive help and therapies. That's Elmira. And then, of course, the Attica uprising of 1971 still reverberates in so many ways. So this is the map of where DOC's facilities are. But if we're thinking about where people are caged in our region, this is only part of the picture. So I'm going to click out of this, hopefully. So here's these are maps from our exhibit, and the website for our exhibit is, well, I'll also put that in the chat. Here's a map that one of our students put together of the region, and you can see that in our area we have not just state prisons, we have county jails, we have federal detention facilities, we have juvenile detention facilities, and then we have state prisons. So I think it's somewhere more than within a 90-minute drive of Rochester's campus. There's something like 30 places where people are kept in cages. So that's the particular kind of landscape that our project takes place in. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristin, who can describe what the project is.
Thanks, Josh. And yeah, if you want to, do you want to leave that map up, or is that, if you want to unshare, you can, but if you want to leave it up, that'll provide a backdrop for as I keep talking. And again, I'm echoing all of Josh's thanks to everyone for being here and for inviting us. So Josh just described the sort of theoretical underpinning that gets us into this project. Another avenue into it, I think for both of us, we both came here through separate trajectories, but around the same time joined the faculty about 11 years ago. I think we're both starting our 12th year teaching. But for me, there was some point a few years in where I suddenly, as I was getting to know where I now live, where I suddenly recognized that there were prisons all around us. I hadn't seen it until then. And the story through which that occurred doesn't matter so much, except to say that there was a moment when this thing that had been sort of unconscious to me or that I was unaware of suddenly came to the forefront of my consciousness. And that, I say that because that's the kind of thing that ethnography is often good at helping us to understand, is how to take something that is naturalized and rendered normal and to bring it into relief and try to understand how it came to be seen as normalized and begin to tease it out and render it more visible. So I just want to say a minute, some things about what ethnography is as the core method to this project. So I guess we've mentioned that both Josh and I are trained as ethnographers. So ethnography, for those of you who don't know, is a method that really involves going into places and understanding them from the perspective of the people who live there, understanding people's life worlds in the ways in which they're situated in them. So that is to say, going places, talking to people, participating in daily life, and taking people's own ways of being in the world quite seriously, and whether or not you agree or disagree with them. And so as Josh and I just were beginning to talk out whether we could do an ethnographic project, trying to understand how the presence of all these prisons surrounding us shapes everyday life, which, as Josh says, is both a specific story, in particular kinds of ways to where we live, but also perhaps a broader American story. We realized that doing this with our students would be the really natural way to do it, because we're both researchers, but also teachers, first and foremost. So we had the good fortune to be able to convince our colleagues that we could co-teach, and to convince students that they might want to join our class, and to get a variety of kinds of support, which is listed on the website, from the university, from the National Science Foundation, from other places, to help support this project. And so over the past 5 years, we have at least one more iteration, but for the past 5 years, we've been teaching a undergraduate seminar that holds somewhere between 20 and 30 students across a range. They come to us from a range of disciplines, a range of backgrounds, a range of class years, a range of places that they are from in the US and outside. And they do some readings with us, think about the conceptual apparatus, think about the method, but really what they do is spend time each week going into these towns. And they typically go off in groups, small groups, 2 to 3, occasionally alone. But they, over the past 5 years, have done work in Albion, in Attica, Auburn, Alden, Batavia, Mount Morris, Elmira, and Rochester. So a variety of these towns. And part of what we're learning increasingly in the recent years is, while we started by naming these towns as discrete places, we're increasingly thinking about that question of edges and interfaces that Josh started us with in that quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the ways that these towns blend into each other in certain kinds of ways that's helping us understand the region better. The students, when they go, they do this like really exciting and creative work. They meet new people they've never met. They wander down Main Street. They hang out in towns like Albion on Halloween night. They strike up conversations while doing trivia night in Albion and Attica and Auburn. They go to sites that exist like the Equal Rights Heritage Center, and they also stumble into old theaters in Alden and have conversations with women about haunted ghosts in the attic. They talk to realtors about housing markets, and they talk to newspaper journalists about various stories. They talk to shopkeepers. They attend church services. They do all manner of things to help begin to understand what it is like for people who live in these towns to live there, and what are the ways that the prison both figures in and doesn't figure in to everyday life. So that's the premise from which the sort of data for this project emerges. Maybe, Josh, I'll just say another very few words about what the exhibit is, and then turn the floor to you to think about a few objects. Is that okay?
Sure, and I'm going to just maybe show some images of how the exhibit was staged while you describe it.
Sure, perfect. Yeah, so we decided to do an exhibit out of this work because basically we felt like the whole purpose of the project is to be engaging in conversation. The process is the product. It's the doing of the work. It's the having the conversations with our students, with people in these towns, that is designed to get us to render visible something that otherwise is invisible. And so we felt like just writing a book or writing an article wasn't going to achieve that effect. So we wanted to do some sort of more participatory and maybe visual and suggestive and provocative form of intervention to stage more conversations. So we began by doing it on campus. And that's where we met Tess, which led us to this conversation, which we hope will yield us more conversations moving forward. But the key thing you're seeing there is we decided on the format of the exhibit, which emerged, again, this format out of conversations with our students, was to be pairings of objects or images with excerpts, brief text excerpts that also came from our students' work. So we have a series of either photographs or actual objects themselves that we then paired with, that emerged out of the students' work, that we then paired with excerpts, either interview quotes or things they had written in their field notes that illustrate some conceptual point or empirical point in relation to the image. So the hope was to, by juxtaposing these forms together, we would both sort of make some claims and draw some connections, but also open up space for people to ask additional questions about how these pieces fit together. As we said, we started by doing this on campus. The exhibit went, again, I think Josh shared the link, or will, so at some point you can poke through if you want. The exhibit on campus addresses some campus-specific issues, issues related in the city of Rochester to the death of Daniel Prude 3 years ago at the hands of Rochester police officers and the protests that emerged out of that in the city and on our campus, as well as engagements with the Department of Public Safety on campus. The goal is to now take this exhibit on the road. We're in conversations to stage it in Brockport and hopefully in Auburn over the course of this year, and then some other places in addition to that. And with the idea being that in each place, we continue to speak to people and learn from them the kinds of questions we're asking of you, and again, have these ongoing conversations and begin to build out additional objects and texts and insights that will continue to yield insights and yield conversations. Let me pass the floor to Josh so he can talk through a couple of the concrete objects.
Yeah, so we each wanted to share a couple of our favorite pairings. I think probably if you're on this call, then you know the category mass incarceration. Mass incarceration referring to the 600% growth of the number of people in prison and jail in the United States since 1970, over the last 50 years. And one of the things that is very much on display in the region is the way, and this is like textbook to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's argument in Golden Gulag, is the way that the rise of the carceral state, the radical expansion of the prison systems, and in particular the state prison system in the 1980s and 90s under Cuomo and Pataki, goes hand in hand or as with deindustrialization. So a town like Albion, as of the mid-1970s, has a Hunt's Birdseye factory, and it has a Lipton factory. There's a Fisher Price factory that's over in Medina, which is the county seat, and those are all gone by the early 80s. Meanwhile, if you go back to the map and look at the where the prisons are, towns in our region like Albion and Attica and Mount Morris, each of which has had a prison for a long time, in the 1980s, each gets a second prison, right? So this particular object I received from the town historian in Albion, and he described finding it a few years ago when in the former Lipton factory, they knocked down a wall while they were producing MREs. Is that what they're called? MREs, emergency rations. And they found like some old products from the 1970s that had never been distributed. So just as this kind of tangible object that points back to when Albion, like so many other towns around here, were manufacturing towns, and how the process of becoming identified in this kind of stigmatized way as prison towns goes hand in hand with this deindustrialization. So that's one object that I cherish especially. If in this object showcased is the rise of mass incarceration and its relationship to the how Americans work and buy things, which is to say the relationship between mass incarceration and the American economy. This object really blew me away because it gestures to that longer history, right? A history as long as not just mass incarceration, but the history of as long as there have been white people in this part of the country, as long as there's been industry in this part of the state. So if you see the pairing, it's a quotation from a collaborator, Wanda, who's a teacher who is family members with incarcerated people, talking about the kinds of surveillance and the treatment of children that she sees in schools, and how that treatment reminds her of what she sees in prison. And again, if you're on this call, then you probably also know the category, the school to prison pipeline, right? And we've become aware of, in recent years, of how the ways that deviance is managed in schools, places children on a track to incarceration. And in the quotation, if you read it through, she's talking about the emergence of, you know, something that happened in the RCSC in the last decade, the emergence of kind of restorative, non-punitive ways of trying to manage conflict so as to try to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. Our pairing here is with this thing here, and this was something I just happened upon in the wild. I was biking to Albany, and there's now a linear trail connecting Syracuse to Rome, and it has these various historical placards. And so about the Erie Canal in the first half of the 19th century. And you see here someone pulling looks to be a child or someone pulling horses along the towpath. And you see here, duped into delinquency. Sometimes young orphans and homeless boys were hired as drivers on the Erie Canal. They were promised a good wage of $10 to $12 per month, which is about $1,000 to $1,500 today. Often these wages were not paid at the end of the season, forcing drivers to beg and steal in order to survive the winter. As a result, many boys spent the off-season in the warmth of a jail cell. Refuge houses were established to save these orphans from a life of crime. So houses of refuge, the first one established in New York City in the 1820s, and the second one established maybe 20 years later here in Rochester, the Western House of Refuge, is the what will eventually become industry in Rush Henrietta, which is to say the youth prison, right? So here, not expecting it at all, just on this bike trip in this park, we see how the criminalization of children has been endemic to industry in Western New York since there has been industry in Western New York. Anyway, it just like blew me away, and I'll pass it on to you, Kristin.
Thanks, Josh. I've changed the one I'm going to talk about. I want to do the Elmira jersey first, and then I'm going to do the candles, Yvette's candles to get us to Batavia. But I want to do the Elmira jersey first. If you can bring that to me. So the one I want to talk about, the story behind, I'm going to tell you the story of how it came to us, but I'll let you look at it for a minute. So in the fall of 2020, we were teaching this class on Zoom, of course, because it was the fall of 2020. And early on in the semester, I'm going to say like October, our students ended up going to, a bunch of them, going down to do some of their ethnographic work that week in Elmira, to participate in and in part help support in leading a protest that was being held by multiple activist organizations around the state to protest the conditions of COVID occurring inside facilities, and in this case specifically Elmira Correctional Facility, which again is a facility that was built in the late 1800s in Elmira that at the time, well, that now is the processing center. So all men who are incarcerated in the state system go through Elmira, I think with very few exceptions, if any. And at the time, the COVID rates, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was like 40 to 50% of incarcerated people at the time had COVID, and this is pre-vaccine. So they went to participate in that protest. They wrote up all these really rich field notes for us, the ones who went. And we had one student who was not able to go, but who wanted to go. He could not go because of the conditions of his parole. He was formerly incarcerated himself. So what he chose to do as his field work for the week was to find local news sources that were streaming online from Elmira that were covering the protests and do sort of an analysis of how the protests were being framed. So while he's doing that work, he sees an advertisement for the Elmira Enforcers, which he then wrote about in his field notes, which he drew to our attention. So the Elmira Enforcers, I'm not a professional hockey follower, but were I don't even know the leagues, Division II, the equivalent of the Red Wings hockey team playing professional hockey league, playing in Elmira, that then apparently closed due to the pandemic. So we were really struck by this image of the Elmira enforcers as the image of this hockey team. Well, even worse, when the team folded, we then were looking into getting one of these jerseys. We were sad to find that the team had folded and that we couldn't get our hands on the professional hockey team jersey. But even better / worse is that we've now learned that the Elmira Junior Enforcers is the sort of tier 1 travel hockey team for kids in Elmira in the region. So I offer this as an example of some of the ways at a very basic level, certain kinds of cultural imagery and notions of gender and masculinity get tied up with ideas of corrections and law enforcement and the prison in particular ways. I'm not trying to claim this happens only in these towns, but I guess a provocation would be, does it happen? To what extent might it happen in particular ways in some of these towns, or have a particular kind of salience, and with what effect? Can I ask you, Josh, to show me the Batavia candles? I was going to talk about the Attica crystals, but we've talked about Attica for a minute. So this, I wanted to mention this one because when we first conceptualized the project, Batavia was in our minds, but not fully in our minds. And then in our second year, we had students who began to work in Batavia, and we've had students increasingly working there in the past years. And it's come to hold, I think, our sense of the role of Batavia as a, quote, prison town in particular ways has emerged much more clearly to us in the last year. Batavia came into our frame because of the location of the ICE facility just off of the thruway there. So we began by asking students to sort of question, what's the ways in which having a federal immigration detention facility in Batavia might shape the town in particular kinds of ways. We've been assured by many, many, many people in Batavia that, quote, you must be asking for these other places. Batavia is not a prison town. We don't have a prison here, which is interesting in and of its own right. Several of our students over the years drew us to, so part of this story is about Batavia and part of it is about the method and the forms of collaboration that we've come to. Many of our students in doing work there began somewhat unexpectedly to them, finding traces of all the work that's being done both by migrant workers, many of whom are undocumented, many of whom pass through the facility in various ways, and work being done to support those people. So they would go into attend a church service to talk to people there and see either Spanish language flyers on the wall or flyers asking parishioners to please bring in items for dignity bags that would be provided to people when they were released from the detention facility and put on buses to go wherever they could go. These students began working with some of these activist organizations, many of which operate not quite underground, but certainly with minimal visibility, gained the trust of some of the people doing this work, and were able to do interviews to learn more from these people, and eventually were able to bring some of these people in to talk to our classes. One of the students who found these objects that you're seeing here, in going back to Batavia and having done work with some of the undocumented people, she herself, having family from Mexico, found what she described as sort of an underground Mexican grocery store where she found these 2 candles. Can you zoom in, Josh, so I can get the names right? They're candles, one for migration, and to the patron saint of migration, and the other one to the patron saint of immigration. So the point here for her was that, as she narrated to us in her field notes, sort of twofold, that these are things that she, as a student researcher, remembers her as a genre of prayer candles that her grandmother had at home as sort of an everyday fixture of life, but she hadn't ever seen them in the context of migration and immigration. And so to rediscover these objects in Batavia, which for her felt quite far from home, and in her mind here on the northern border, disconnected from migration of people from areas from which she hailed, struck her as sort of an interruption and a reminder of the ways that these issues interface with everyday life. So as objects, they felt powerful to us. And we paired them with this quote from, Josh, if you can zoom out, from Reverend Hava, who is someone who's born and raised in this area, but who has been thinking about supporting people in these ways, people who found their way to this region in these ways for a long time. So again, this was a way for us to think about and invite people to think about not only state prisons and not only youth facilities like Josh mentioned in relation to children, but also broader questions of our border policing and how that inflects our region as well. I think we've now been talking at you plenty long, and we thought, if I'm not mistaken, Josh, we thought that we could turn the floor over to our moderators to either pull questions from you all or ask us questions directly.
Okay, I'll come back on here and help facilitate this. So let's start out. Betsy Friedman put a question in the Q&A. I think you said like Rochester is like an epicenter of incarceration. Is it we have a higher concentration than other parts of the country? Was that part of what you told us?
Yeah, I can handle that. In fact, maybe I should share my screen again. Hold it, if I can find what I just did with yeah. So you can see, oh,
We can't
okay.
see it.
So
There we go.
now you can see it.
Yeah.
Yes, we don't see the map yet, but I know you're taking us there.
Yeah. So this is from a prison policy institute report from prison policy initiative report from 2022. They kind of have the best national data on who's locked up, which is the state data isn't that hard to get. The county data, you're dealing with algorithms because there's so much churn. But as of 2022, so these are incarceration rates around the state. As of 2022, the city of Rochester has the highest incarceration rate in the state. Over 1,000 out of 100,000, over 1% of Rochester's residents are incarcerated. And this incarceration rate is 6 times the incarceration rate of New York City, which isn't to say that there aren't these so-called, $1 million blocks, that there aren't neighborhoods in the Bronx that have higher incarceration rates. But what we see in this, in the kind of shifting landscape of mass incarceration is that, as poverty has moved, as deindustrialization has happened, and the cities and wealth has returned to the cities and capital has gathered around the cities, and poverty has kind of moved upstate, so too has the incarceration rate has followed, right? So right, at least as of 2 years ago, Rochester has the highest incarceration rate in the state.
Okay, and I mean, when Tess first saw your thing last spring, she just was blown away and shared with me how important this area is to the whole history of prisons in this country, which I'd never had any idea about. So we're seeing things like these small towns, because they do, they put the prisons on the periphery, as you said. So you've got small towns, deindustrialization. So then the industry is prisons. So you've got like a generation coming up in these small towns where the best jobs in town are working in prisons. Is that part of what some of your students were finding?
Yeah, I can take that, Josh, if you want. Absolutely, that's one of the dynamics, is the ways that people talk about it as a job. And if you click through the site, we have a couple job posting ads. I mean, the students would find, just walking around these towns, they find the flyer. Do you want to be a CEO? Call this number. They brought them to us from the front desk of the public library in these towns, from the bulletin board outside the restroom at the gas station in these towns, from a wide variety of places. And yeah, I mean, certainly for many people, it was just, they both saw the ubiquity of these flyers and they heard the discourse from people in the towns talking about it, from people describing their own family history, and the residents talking about, well, this is what I learned growing up. My parents told me X, Y, and Z. My father and my grandfather were CEOs. This is a good, this is a good living. This is the thing you do when you stay here. This is something that'll set you up with a pension. And obviously that is related to just what you just described and what Josh mentioned earlier, shifts in the landscape around deindustrialization. One of the big dynamics we heard about, again, from our work and our students' work, the ways people talk about the consolidation of family farms into sort of big farming in the regions, and therefore as farming shifts out of the region, there's different kinds of opportunities for people. But the economic piece is definitely a piece of it. I think we don't want to overdetermine that as the only piece, in the sense that there's also ways in which people come to see sort of imagined futures in certain kinds of jobs. I mean, one thing I'll say quickly, we had a project early on, it's not on our website, but a student did a project where she was really interested in how students talk about over time what they want to do when they grow up. So she looked at all the yearbooks. She went to the local library in Albion, and she looked at the yearbooks starting from like the 60s onward, or the 70s onward. She wanted to understand if there was any correlation when the second facility in Albion was built. So Albion has a women's facility, a medium security women's facility that was built in the late 1800s. And then it got Orleans Correctional Facility, a medium facility for men. I'm forgetting the exact date. Late 70s, early. Say again?
84.
84. So her question was, with the addition of this additional facility, do we see any shift in what teenagers' perception of what they want to be when they grow up? And the way she chose to look into that, which we thought was really creative and brilliant, was to look in yearbooks at the senior statements. I'm going to go do this after school. Now, again, we're not saying that this is like a perfect fact in the world. It's more like a gesture towards an idea. But she sat there diligently in the library and coded all of these yearbooks from the 70s up until the present. And she did see a demonstrable shift in around the mid 80s to where more people were talking about going into law enforcement. She lumped law enforcement, the military, policing, and people interested in family farming, started to decline pretty rapidly. Again, that's loose data, but it certainly, I keep speaking to the method. That struck me as a really creative way and an ethnographic way to think about what are the ideas that circulate in people's minds in relation to these prisons, about the possible futures that they have for themselves and different generations in relation to these shifting winds around them.
So the era of mass incarceration sort of started taking off in, would it be the 80s? Was it a little before that, the mid 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can tell the story starting in Attica if you want. You could tell the story starting in the civil rights movement if you want. But the prison building booms in California and New York begin in the 1980s.
Okay, so that's 45 years ago. So we've got basically two generations of people who have grown up with the surge in incarceration. And now we see a serious and conscious effort to reverse that. And we've had a bunch of prison closings. So what I'm envisioning then is that there's a whole bunch of people in these towns that that's their livelihood. And so we've created a block of people who are opposed to slowing down incarceration or decreasing incarceration, which is really horrifying. Like, that shouldn't be a part of the debate on how many people ought to be in jail.
But 100%, and this is why, with thinking about the prison industrial complex and thinking about carceral geographies, we come to see the embeddedness, how prisons become necessary in a world without prisons comes to be in some ways unimaginable, right? Because like the positive, like the relationship is complex, right? There's pride, there's stigma, the like positive identification that you saw with the Elmira enforcers. There's also a negative identification, right, of a desire not to be associated with the prison. And on the one hand, these are the union jobs that are available, and on the other hand, they're seen as terrible jobs. doing 25 to life, 8 hours at a time. But it is, it's you wouldn't be wrong, right, in thinking about the abandonment of our region by capital in deindustrialization in the 80s and 90s. You wouldn't be wrong if you lived in Attica or Albion, that your town is one prison closure away from not existing, right? And we are in an era, I would say, I don't exactly understand what era we're in. On the one hand, there are half as many people in state prisons now than there were 15 years ago. There's clearly serious decarceration efforts. On the other hand, with the Cop City being built in Atlanta and the kind of police training facilities being built around the state, I think we're in a time of contestation, but we are in a time of decarceration in the sense of prison closures, and that is chilling, right? That is chilling. And when we think about the kinds of relationships that we're looking to build by means of these projects, we're thinking about, okay, what would be the kind of political coalition we can have in this part of the state that would work to decarcerate and to create opportunities in the communities, disproportionately Black and brown urban communities, although as we saw, it's also white rural communities, but look to foster, to decarcerate while also looking to create economic opportunities in these towns that depend on incarceration as their industry.
So I'm going to guess that people, when they come out of prison, they don't tend to stick around whatever small town their prison was close to. Is that true, or do they? I mean, students go to college and end up staying on, but I don't think.
That's a really great question, and one that we're still trying to pin down. And it's, with any of this work, people tell, what we know is we know that people have told us things. There's then a different question about to what extent we then, peg some factual claim to the things they told us, if that makes sense. As in, people have ideas about the towns they live in, and sometimes we can sort of identify whether those things are, quote, true or false. And around sort of forms of history, we could do that differently. But part of what ethnographic work is about is helping us understand the stories we tell ourselves about the places that we live, and we could say the same things about the stories Rochesterians tell ourselves about the city of Rochester. So I say all that as prelude to say, people, there are people certainly in these towns who have ideas that, oh, that area of town is not a good area of town. That's the area where the people, they say two things. They say that's the area of town where the people who come to live when they visit, when they have family members who are incarcerated, or they say that's the area of town where people stay after they've been released. And it will not shock you to imagine that there's racial dynamics in these small towns to how they describe those regions. And that's been described to us in very consistent ways across most of these towns. When we then say to people, oh, great, our students say, well, can you introduce me, take me to see this area, or introduce me to somebody who either is here to visit a relative or stayed. We have yet to really meet many of those people. So the question of what, again, it would take a different kind of demographic research to really trace some sort of factual claim about that. But that's certainly not the sense that we get from also the work we do with, on the other side and the other sort of reports. I don't see this as certainly as another added point. All of these towns have historic populations of Black residents, for example, that are that predate the prison or are unrelated to the prison, that are about the Great Migration North, that are about jobs, that are not about the prison. But what we see time and time again is the ways that the either pre-existing or otherwise existing Black communities in these towns get coded and stigmatized in relation to the prison in very consistent and dramatic ways.
I think I heard talk about that in Auburn with the O wing. Is that what they call it?
Yes, O block. Yeah, that Orchard Street. We learned from some of our students that at least, at least for a time, that this Orchard Street, which is near the prison, which used to be the Italian portion of town that then shifted over time and sort of hit on harder times, and is an area where it's lower income and that has more Black residents, that this was a student who himself is Black, who was doing work, and people kept saying to him, people kept mentioning O'Block to him, and he kept asking sort of, what about this? And then as he was striking that he was being sort of interpolated, or sort of put in the way people were assuming that that's where he either was from or had a family member there or wanted to go there, and that got him asking questions about, wait a minute, what's up with race in this town? And then he ended up finding people there and interviewing them, and the fact that this area of town that is where many Black people live and lower income Black people live is referred to not just as Orchard Street, but as O Block, which is of course extending the language of blocks named by letters. That is the spatial geography of the inside onto the outside. So yeah.
So
there's a really interesting comment by someone who worked in prisons. I want to get to that in a second, but there was a question earlier that we didn't get to address, was like the question, it's no longer there, but are there many prisons in this region? And to the, I would give two answers to that. One is that, per capita, yes, right, that you have a bunch of prisons down in Westchester County, but per capita, you have far more prisons in this part of the state. But then there's also a kind of the place, and this is Kristin, I don't know if you want to do this riff, but the place of upstate in the geography of incarceration in New York State. Do you want to?
Sure. It's like all my notes to say this. We totally forgot to say this. And you should probably interrupt me when I get it wrong. But yeah. So the title of the exhibit, which Josh gets full credit for realizing that this is obviously what we always should have been calling this exhibit all along, which occurred to us 4 days before the exhibit opened as we were casting about for title. We had been, as Josh mentioned, we both work with the Rochester Education Justice Initiative. I teach, Josh is the faculty director. I've been teaching for the program for a while. I'm currently teaching in Attica Correctional Facility. We were having a meeting over food with various allies, teachers in the program, formerly incarcerated students. And we were probably sort of all putting our heads together to try to troubleshoot for a particular student who was formerly incarcerated, was taking courses on the outside, but had been, as we were trying to parse out, had been, we thought, reincarcerated. And we were all sort of putting our heads together and talking with his family to try to figure out what was happening and how we could support him. And he was being, as far as we could understand it, what was being described to us was that he was being held in the county jail. But then suddenly somebody asked the question of, okay, well, when will he be going upstate? And that jarred us because of the ways we've been thinking of the geography of the region, that in fact his quote going upstate, as he was sitting in Rochester, and he was going to be in fact going south to Elmira if he was going to be going upstate, where in the context where going upstate in that language meant going into the state system. So the question, the ways in which sort of going upstate is both a spatial distribution based on the maps that Josh showed at the very beginning, but also, so it's both a physical movement and also, I don't want to say a state of mind, because prison is not a state of mind, but it's a metaphor for more than simply leaf peeping in the Catskills. But it's so the point is, this idea upstate is both exactly where we are, and we are always upstate all the time here, but upstate also is a broader set of conditions that exist in other places around the state. And one, I think it's a particular New York term. I would imagine that, but I don't know. It's a question of how it gets discussed. The point is, what's the corollary? I don't know what the corollary term is in California, for example, or in Pennsylvania. I don't know, but I would imagine that there's another language that means the same, another emic term that means that move, that's both spatial and about the state system.
The whole idea that in New York City, people think of upstate as a prison, and coming to Rochester is torture. It's kind of horrifying to me, but whatever. So I'm going to turn the subject for a minute, since we're a League of Women Voters group here. So I've been registering voters in Rochester since about 2007, 2008, and every single time you go to a public event and try to register somebody, you run into someone who's, first they're evasive. They'll just say, no, I don't vote. I don't do that. And if you can strike up a conversation with them, it'll come out that, yeah, I have a felony in my record and therefore I can't vote. And it's it's been a big deal for us because there's so much misinformation going around, right? So it has never been true in the state of New York that just because you once committed a felony, you can never vote again. And yet that's what everyone believes. So for a long time, it was true that you had to have finished your probation or your parole before you could vote again. And then we had a really confusing intermediary period where the governor was partially pardoning some people to restore voting rights, and he never said who he was pardoning and how he decided. So that was really confusing. And now, like, the minute you're let out the door, you get your right to vote back, even if you're still on probation. But none of that penetrates the popular understanding. So there's just an incredibly large percentage of the poor neighborhoods in Rochester where people, you talked about 1% are in jail at any one time. So if you look like in the last 25 years, I'm guessing maybe, I don't know, 20 or 25 or 30% of the people in the poorest neighborhoods have put in time in jails, and they all believe they can't vote. And we have neighborhoods where nobody votes, and it changes the politics of this region and this county considerably. If those people started to vote, then we would have different mayors elected and different county executives elected and different county legislature majorities, and the pressures on the budget would be different. What we've got is white suburbs where the only campaign motto is to cut taxes and cut services, and that's not what the people in the poor neighborhoods would be voting for if they were voting. So I just want to commend to you the importance of that as an effect of all this mass incarceration and the fact that we're living with so many former prisoners in our community. I know that each time you do this class, you have a slightly different take on what the assignment is.
We're also that's all true, but we're also, in a heyday of social movements that are pushing for change, both locally and in Albany, right? And a lot of those, I'm thinking of groups like the RAP campaign that are pushing for the expansion of parole opportunities for elderly prisoners and people who've been incarcerated a long time, and Vocal New York. Like, a lot of these organizations have formerly incarcerated people in their leadership. So, best of times, worst of times. I would really, I would love to be able to hear more from Lillian.
Yes, I was
yeah.
just going to open her camera. So Lillian, I think I've enabled you. In fact, I'm gonna, for the moment, promote you. You are now a panelist. If you want to turn your camera on. So I don't know if everyone else could see it, but Lillian worked in prisons in California for many years and has lived in these prison towns.
And
I
doing
think
prison siting.
Can you hear me?
SITING, where prisons get put. Yes.
Yes, we can
But
hear you.
I don't know how to turn my camera on, unfortunately.
so in the bottom left of your screen, there's a little thing that says start video or stop video. It's right next to your microphone that says mute or unmute.
Uh-oh. Well,
That's assuming you have a camera on your computer, which not every computer does.
I am so not technical, but
Okay.
I can talk.
Go
If
for
that's
it.
okay. I mean, I'd love to be on there, but I'm not able to. So it'd probably be helpful if you wanted me to be more specific, because I did work in the Department of Corrections for 10 years. I'm no longer working there. I retired in 96. But as I wrote in my comment, I started working in the Department of Corrections in the governmental section, not in a prison. And this was the big prison building boom in the 80s, which you referred to, which probably happened everywhere in the country. But I think California was probably leading the
100%.
leading the force. And so we would go to small communities, small, mostly rural communities up and down the state where we were invited. We had to be invited. We just didn't come in and, you know, force a prison on a community. So I think a lot of people don't understand that part. So we were invited because they could see, or they understood, that there would be some economic benefit to having a prison in their community. So one of the more well-known prisons, at least in California, maybe you even know about it, is called Pelican Bay. It's what they now refer to as a supermax prison. And I worked on the siting of that and the community meetings before the siting and before it was decided that we would go there. And I, you know, I've been able to, I live in Oregon now, in Southern Oregon, but I do travel through Crescent City, and I've seen the changes, just the physical changes. You know, there's Walmart is the first thing to come in, it seems, when a prison goes into a town, which also disrupts the business community and puts a lot of small mom and pop businesses out of business. So the town I lived in, Susanville, which is a rural town in northeastern California, very rural. So Walmart came in. Walmart based their coming in to town based on the population, which they thought was the population of the city of Susanville, but they had brought the prison into the city limits. Therefore, it looked like there were more people in the community. But many of those residents, so-called residents, are not going to be shopping at Walmart because they're incarcerated, to the tune of, before the other prison closed, 6,000 inmates. So of a town of 17,000, 6,000 were not going to shop at Walmart or any other place. But anyway, a lot of the small, you know, local businesses closed. So that was a real, in my opinion, a real negative. But the things I would tell these communities that were interested in a prison about the economic benefits, after working and living in a prison town, I couldn't legitimately and honestly say, because I think it's more disruptive to the community at large than it is a benefit.
Why was that? Yeah, what I mean, why when you make that judgment, what do you have in mind?
Well, okay, so I'm a little biased because I worked there, and I didn't come up through the ranks. I wasn't a correctional officer. I went in as a correctional counselor, which is like a case manager, not a psychologist. So I didn't have that experience of being in uniform, but I was a sworn peace officer. Anyway, so the majority of the people that lived in the town that were employed by one of the prisons. So we had two prisons. And before, when I first went there was only one prison. When the next prison came in, which was also a supermax prison, I could see the complexion of the town changing in terms of the type of correctional officers were much harder. You know, they're much more like that picture of the hockey team, you know, that image of some really macho buffed guy. And so it changed the tone of the town. Mm-hmm. I have so much to say about this. I don't want to take up all the time.
We would love to talk to you more. I don't want to cut you off, but I also do want to say that I hope that if you're so interested, we would love to have another conversation with you. I would
love to. In fact, I'm writing sort of a so-called memoir about my experience working and living in the prison town. But I would love to talk to you more, because your exhibit sounds really fascinating, and I hadn't heard of this woman who wrote Golden Gulag, and I'm definitely wanting to read that. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you guys some more.
I've just dropped my, thank you. We've just dropped our emails in the chat. So
yeah, and I was just gonna, sorry, I'm speaking over you, Dash. I apologize. I was just gonna say thank you, and that's again we're so thrilled that you spoke up, and part of are, as we said, I think when I talked about the exhibit and Josh said earlier on, part of our method behind the whole project is for it to be a snowball gathering snow, I guess, as we, or whatever the other metaphor is, to learn more from people, to gather more stories, to see how this, to build out the conversations, and also to the question from earlier on, to what extent, and this goes to Josh's earlier point, we're constantly pivoting between, to what extent is this like a New York story versus an American story, and part of what you just demonstrated for us is the ways that there certainly are like specificities to the particular locations that we're talking about, but there's also a broader abstract point that pulls out to think about the ways that what we're talking about here is an American story, not not only an upstate New York one. So thank you so much for your comments.
Yeah, sure. Glad to talk to you.
All right, so I'm just looking at the list of participants. I'm wondering if any of you.
I see a question from Tess in the chat. Can we speak to that? Would that be
Sure.
okay?
Yeah.
Can I jump? I was going to jump in on that, Josh, and I have a preliminary thought, and you can add to that. The question is about we have pride in the region's progressive history, and the League of Women Voters has its roots here. What's the connection between that history and our carceral geography? So I'm not going to give you a historian's answer, because I'm not a historian, but I'll give you an example from our exhibit, at least the thing it got me thinking about. So, our student, I've gone to this, and many of you on the call perhaps have gone, and our students have gone to the new Equal Rights Heritage Center in Auburn, which opened, I'm forgetting if it was 2018 or 2019. I think it was 2018. It opened during the first semester of our class. And if I have it right, it came with money from the governor towards sort of, it was state money, and it was part of the revitalization of the downtown corridor and the Finger Lakes region, and Auburn and specifically, and it was about part of the sort of rebranding of Auburn as history's hometown, I think is how they phrase it. And so our students spent a lot of time going in there, and I'm going to see if I can get this right. There's sort of 3 pillars of the exhibit: abolition of slavery, human rights, and women's rights. I think I have that right. So our students were interested in how, to your point, Tess, this exhibit seems to me to be one of the ways that this region tells stories about our local history. There's a statue of Harriet Tubman out front. Harriet Tubman's home and her burial ground are just down the road. It spotlights Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, all the heavy hitters. The Seward House is right nearby. And yet, there's a couple of pieces of that exhibit that are that in fact don't connect to any of this, right? This is just a stone's throw away from Auburn Correctional Facility, which has a sign on the front saying, site of the first electrocution. That town has a replica of the electric chair in Swabi's bar. The map, as you enter the Equal Rights Heritage Center, there's sort of a hand-drawn map that points to the various tourist sites in town, and where the prison is on the map is literally a blank space. It's just pink, or whatever the color of the background of the map is. So it's literally erasing the prison off the map, which again, at some level you can concede that this is a map of like tourist sites that you can go visit, and they say, but it's not a tourist site, but the site itself does have historical markers in front of it. But the broader point being that the ways that there is an absence of a connection between the movements to abolish slavery in earlier generations and the contemporary movements for prison abolition. The absence of this, if you think about sort of what are some of the pressing human rights and civil rights issues of our time, criminal justice, mass incarceration, the caging of humans is arguably one of those top issues. And so the fact that there would be, originally in 2018, our students found 0 mentions of Auburn Correctional Facility in the Equal Rights Heritage Center. At this point, they found a couple traces. Again, we've watched it sort of roll out over time. So my point here is not a takedown of the Heritage Center by any means, but rather a recognition of the complicated ways we tell stories about our region, and the complicated ways that we lift up some things and erase others, and then to point to the possibilities for offering alternative discussions. And Josh, maybe you want to talk to the Josh went to see, I couldn't go, but Josh went to see Angela Davis give a talk just like down the road from the Equal Rights Heritage Center this past spring. And I know you had more positive things to say in some ways about the possibilities for addressing these kinds of questions in local histories.
She didn't. So we were in Auburn, and I was prepared to have my head explode if she didn't address the prison. That would have that really would have been like a fallen idol moment. This is Angela Davis is in some ways like the progenitor of contemporary prison abolition. Anyway, she got around to it and she said beautiful, brilliant things about it. So and I would, maybe we can show our exhibit in the Equal Rights Heritage Center. But you know, to test to your question, you know, this is I have two thoughts. Like one is this is capital for us. I mean, this is a tool for us. This is a like the you know, for the first time this fall we have some students at Attica who are pursuing University of Rochester BA, and that's a huge win. And we that question of like, okay, you know, so here's this august legacy of Douglas and Anthony, and what does that mean today? And this, what it means today is to be working to decarcerate, right? That's what we believe that. And so we use that rhetoric and it because we believe in it, and it helps us move the needle sometimes. But I would say like your question is like the call to arms, right? Like you're quite like, and this is why, you know, we work with two of our colleagues in the college and prison in REGI, the Rochester Education Justice Initiative, Precious Bedell and Thomas Gant are also deeply involved in the work of these community organizations, the Center for Community Alternatives, Vocal New York, the RAP campaign, and we try to connect, we try to plug our students into those lobby days in Albany, you know, where we think, okay, they can learn so much about the process, you know, how bills actually become laws in this state it's a very frustratingly opaque thing, as you know, and like the Clean Slate Act was passed by both chambers of the legislature in June and is sitting on the governor's desk. And how does something go from being, anyway, there's a lot of backroom dealing in this state, as you all know. But in any case, we want to we're at the University of Rochester. It's the largest employer in the region, and we want to do what little we can to help so that that this important site in the history of the struggle for freedom is contributing commensurably today, right? So that's, I would take your question largely as an exhortation, which is that it's our task to live out those connections between that history and our present. And I'm sure that most people or everyone on this call feels the same way.
So tell me again the year that Auburn Correctional Facility opened. It was
1822, I believe.
so all the years that Harriet Tubman was living there in Auburn, she was coexisting with the beginning of
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you know it you know, we talk about the history of the, you know, the beginnings of prisons in the United States, and you know, we usually that story starts in Philadelphia and like the Quakers and but you know, that experiment failed, and it really is the Auburn model that becomes the standard that gets duplicated not just around the country but around the world.
Mm-hmm. All right. Gonna give one more call to the audience. Anyone got anything they want to bring up? Jan McKay, you've worked in prisons and in jails. You got anything to say? Judy Sternberg, you've been lobbying on all these carceral issues that Josh has been mentioning. You got anything you want to add? I'd be happy to promote you and I'll let you talk. No, nobody's taking me up on it.
I mean, all I'll say is to echo, you know, we have our emails there. Like we are all, you know, our project methodologically, in some ways, we want to have our cake and eat it too, right? On the one hand, there's something special about these communities that actually have a prison in them. On the other hand, all of us who live in the contemporary United States intersect with issues of incarceration in so many ways that are obvious and subtle. And so if at some point you want to share insights or your experiences, drop us a line. We want to hear from you.
All right. Judy took me up on my offer. So Judy, I've promoted you. If you want to turn your camera and your mic on, we'd love to hear from you.
I don't see, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't see the opportunity to turn a camera on. I do see a thing that says I can join as a panelist, but
Just start your video. It should be fine.
I don't see the symbol there.
Next to the one where it says mute and unmute.
Yeah, there's not a symbol for
Oh,
that.
okay.
So anyway, my question is talking about legislation, and you referred to RAP and the parole bills, the elder parole, and the
Fair and timely parole.
right, a couple dealing with
And there's the
more
13.
opportunities to get out. There's another piece of legislation about second look, being able to revisit sentences. There's legislation about having free phone calls in prison and jails, because that's a very crazy system. And it's very interesting too, the Rochester area because in the jails and prisons, the facilities get a percentage of the charge for the phone calls. But the rates of the basic phone service varies greatly. So Rochester has takes a very high percentage cut from the phone calls, but it's a very low rate. The phone charges are very low in Rochester, so it's a funny thing. Anyway, what are some of the other pieces of legislation? No slavery in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It's really getting the wording of slavery out of the New York State Constitution. And then there's, I forget the name of it, but there's one that deals with kind of like fair labor for coerced labor in the jails, and the outside businesses when you're looking at the sanitizer and the conditions and the what people are paid. And one of the things, one of the people on the state committee, the League Committee on Criminal Justice, is a formerly incarcerated woman who's spent over 20 years in prison. But what people don't realize is not only is it pennies that people earn when they're working, but it does not go towards Social Security or anything. They have nothing. They're not eligible for anything. For the people who spend many years and decades in prison and work during those years. So there's a lot of, in terms of legislation, it's both looking at helping people get out of prison and then looking at conditions in the prisons. So there are a lot of pieces of legislation, a lot of different issues.
Yeah, so the League has an active statewide team from all over the state that lobbies on these bills all the time.
There's a very active downstate in New York City and the Rikers Island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Thanks
kind
for
of
sharing that,
invisible.
Judith.
Yeah. All right. Well, it seems like we might be at an end here this evening. So I'd like to thank you both for coming and talking with us.